or Indigiqueer people, presented by Dr. Percy Lezard. I'm located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoik, and the Attawandaron peoples. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Wherever you are located today, please think about the traditional lands you are situated on and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands. This webinar series focuses on gender-based violence, trauma, and healing and wellness. It is essential that this work centers the historical and current injustices that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples endure in Canada, and in particular, the violence experienced by missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals. I'm going to call on my colleague, Lillian Weroniak, to introduce Dr. Lezard.
Thank you, Linda. Wajay, hello, everybody. My name is Lillian Weroniak. I am a member of the Moose Cree First Nations. I'm originally from Moose Factory, Ontario, and that's the mouth of James Bay, and I'm currently residing in London, Ontario. I am the Indigenous Implementation Coordinator at the Center of Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub teams, welcome to this 5th webinar of our 2020 and 2023 webinar series, Gender-Based Violence Against Two-Spirit People. I'm honored to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Percy Lezard is a Schoolox registered. I do apologize. I do hope I got that correct. Registered with Picton Indian Band in unceded British Columbia and centers Indigenous knowledge, teaching and research methodologies in their work. They're an assistant professor of Indigenous studies at Laurier University. Percy centers 2 SLGBTQ+ experiences of gender-based violence in their work. Percy is a survivor of the multi-generational impacts of the residential school system and the 60s scoop. Welcome, Dr. Percy Lezard.
White folks, I just want to say I'm going to do my best. I tested positive for COVID. So I'm going to mute myself so I can cough and sneeze as much as I can. But I felt that this time people set aside to be in meaningful critical reflexivity about the daily lived experiences of the 2 SLGBTQQIA folks. So I just first wanted to preface that. So I'm going to go slow because I'm at that point where it's hard to breathe. Yeah, so I appreciate your patience. This is not a light topic. It's not something where people want to go and run a marathon, or you may be left with some feels if you are Black, Indigenous, or racialized, or have shared identities in terms of 2 SLGBTQQIA, disabled, because these also impact folks with intersecting identities. Hopefully you will reach out to the list of resources that are available to you. I want to be mindful that I have not vetted them. I don't know who they are, but I believe if something should come up or it impacts you physically, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, please reach out. Whatever grounding techniques, safety techniques, brave techniques, because it's unethical for me to say it's going to be safe. Please do that. I know I can vet, if you're a young person, the work of LGBT Youth Line. I can vet relatives working at one of the many Two-Spirit agencies across this country, Transforming Embers in unceded British Columbia, Edmonton Two-Spirit Society, Two-Spirit Machif in Manitoba, Two-Spirited People of Manitoba, Two-Spirited People of the First Nations in Toronto, the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance, and Two Spirits in Motion. Those are people that I can vet. Those are people that I work with actively, and they have supports for people who have shared lived identities. Cisgendered folks, heterosexual folks, don't over-inundate these people to give you support. There's so many things set up for you institutionally across this country for support. So those are who you can turn to. That was a mouthful. So yes, I'm accustomed to paying attention to the chat and the Q&A. I'm going to leave that to the people behind the scenes. So if you're sending me something, if you're one of my colleagues, former students, community member, I won't be able to see it till the end because I have COVID brain and I'm doing my best to be focused on the slides in front of us. So some of the things that folks will be able to, having access to me, having access to this content, and having access to some of the information, these are one of the three things that you'll be able to go away with in your various disciplines and sectors. This doesn't just stretch into the helping sector, which is often associated with social work. It also can go into education for children, for adults, for teens. It can go into the mental health, the health sector, the needs of the folks that we support or that we see, and also the systems of carceral oppression, otherwise known as the criminal justice system. So these are the ways in which some of the outcomes, plus a lot more. I don't like to over inundate people, but you will definitely be able to leave with many more outcomes than I have presented. Also, it won't make sense until maybe a week, a month, a year later. You may be discomforted on what I might be sharing. You might be unsettled. But I think that is my purpose as someone who creates learning environments has always been my goal. Because education up to this point has done a continued disservice to First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Afro-Indigenous, Black Indigenous people, also with intersecting identities. That includes the 2SLGBTQQIA community. So yeah, so those are some of the things. Folks can take the time to read that. I don't want to read verbatim because that makes for a very boring presentation. When this is not a boring topic. This is an issue that has been time immemorial for First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Afro-Indigenous, Black Indigenous folks with intersecting identities. Much like, thank you folks who did an introduction. Take a minute to breathe. It's always important for folks who speak on Indigenous topics such as this are in fact verified Indigenous people. I want to role model positionality and share an accountability statement that I am a verified status First Nations member under the Indian Act to Penticton Indian Band, under our custom code as a people, the Scalo, Silch, or Sukanang people. I have membership. Why Esquist and Cha Percy Lezard. I'm at Maskelo. My relations are the Lezards from Sinpington, which is the village between lakes, or a place to live forever. 2 camps from the language speakers. The Krugers from Arrow Lakes, the origins of the oldest family, of the biggest family, of the oldest family, of the biggest family. The Baptistes from Chupaka. And as a part of my scale of cultural practice, I want to begin my introduction with an acknowledgement of my positionality and responsibilities in an era across the academic industrial complex of race shifters and pretend Indians. It's important to identify who I am, who are my people, and who claims me. I am the adult child of Indian residential school survivors and day school survivors, Valerie Lezard, Moses Baptiste, and day school survivor Pierre Kruger. My maternal grandparents were also Indian residential school survivors, and they are Tui Palwitzia Elizabeth Lezard, prior to being married, their last name Manuel. Tui Ernest Lezard. My paternal grandparents were also Indian residential school survivors, and they are Tui Catherine Baptiste Alex, prior to being married, and Tui George Baptiste. Again, we're all members of St. Pinkton under our nation's custom membership and registered status First Nation members under the Indian Act to the Penticton Indian Band, which is number 597. Scale Homelands claim me as a member of their nation in unceded British Columbia. My nation also extends to the invisible border called Canada and US to call Confederated Tribes in Washington State. I also bear the responsibilities as a firekeeper, a healer, and come from a long line of hereditary chiefs prior to Indian Act band chief and councils. Okay, I'm just going to cough. Oh, goodness. And gives interpreters time to switch over. Lim lump for that. For folks who are new in their disciplines and wanted to expand their knowledge base on gender-based violence, here is a definition or something that you can read on what in gender-based violence is. And it's for folks who benefit from a for us by us framework. This was given at the generosity, the continued generosity of family members or individuals who themselves had experienced gender-based violence. And I want to differentiate with Indigenous people. I want to be specific about how it's colonial violence, in the sense that it's historical, multi-generational, and the thing that is left over more often is intergenerational trauma. It also includes social and economic marginalization, maintaining a status quo, an institutional lack of will, and in ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQQIA folks. I wanted to be very clear about this came directly from the executive summary for the National Inquiry. I know that was a rush process, and I don't know why the Canadian government forced the commissioners and the knowledge keepers who were supporting them to get this done in 2 years, whereas Justice Marie Sinclair and their fellow commissioners had 6 years, 7 years to gather 6,000 stories. But here we are. It was able to give birth to that process and name the legacy of colonial violence, particularly on Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQQIA folks. I'm gonna cough. Okay. Okay. I'm doing my best. Okay, that's my moment for, okay. And so many folks might want to ask, why do we need to learn or know about the experiences of two-spirit trans folks? And one of the things, as the lead writer, I should say that I'm the lead writer of the document that is one of the resources in the later part of the slides, because this, I want to preface as well, this is not just intellectual, this is personal, in the sense that my family had reported 6 relatives missing and 5 later reported murdered. So this is not just something I'm othering. This is not something I'm observing as a voyeuristic gaze. This is something that my family currently is going through with the confirmation of our relative. where they had to use DNA to confirm their identity. So much like the red paper policy, which is a reaction to the white paper policy in 1969, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in the 90s, the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, which was gifted to the world in 2015, with the results and the findings of the National Inquiry and subsequent final reports from the various stakeholders and provinces and territories and groups. Many of these documents and processes to us LGBTQQIA folks and kin are erased from agenda-based analysis. And that's one thing in this report. We as a committee, and this committee was compiled of 15 people nationally who reflected diverse identity of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, to us LGBTQQIA identity and age, was able to contribute our own experiences as people who experience violence, of our chosen bio extended family members who were targets of violence, into the gender-based analysis. And I further talk about that further in the slides. One thing that I want to be very clear about, it's Black scholars, Black femmes, Black thinkers, Black queer folks, Black trans folks who continue to lead the way in supporting Indigenous discourse, such as this final Two-Spirit Subworking Group's final report, and was able to give the foundation of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in coining the term intersectionality in the late 80s, and giving us the foundation as a subworking group to really look at the experiences and nuance the experiences of 2S LGBTQQIA folks. Okay, I'm gonna cough. Okay. So in this process and us meeting together for 18 months as we gathered information and stories from our relatives nationally, from our relatives in the north, the Inuit folks, from trans, gender diverse, non-binary folks who were experienced gender-based violence or sex workers, we were able to look at how intersectionality in the case of this report and this experience impacted diverse factors of folks' Indigenous identity in terms of race, class, sex, gender, residency, geography, disability, and age. One of the things that I want to leave you folks with, my colleague, sibling in the struggle and the fight, Dr. Sarah Hunt, documents that in terms of this phenomenon, that Indigenous knowledge allows for diverse forms of knowledge to be valued, including the wisdom of elders, dreams, and spiritual guides, relations that extend beyond the human to include other animals, the land, water, and all living things. Indigenous languages are embedded with concepts reflecting the interconnectedness of all things. Some of these concepts translated into English that can and not be only inclusive of all my relations, weaving the strands and a web of community relations. And that's one of the things that we had hoped to capture in this first of its kind document. Yeah. So yeah, that's one thing that I'm very grateful, the gift from Dr. Sarah Hunt and their work and working with folks in the downtown east side and the experiences of gender-based violence against Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQQIA folks. No, appreciate your patience. I see that there are Q&As and hopefully my colleagues are attending to those folks. COVID brain, I can only focus on one thing. Which brings us to using the fire as a metaphor. As a member and the writer of the Two-Spirit Subworking Group, we designed this user-friendly diagram to represent a 2S LGBTQQIA approach to gender-based violence. And I know it's small on your screen, folks, so I'll do my best to do a descriptive. And the following diagram, as you can see, or you can't, I know I'm having difficulty on my end. The stones, gray, which are along the bottom, represents the strengths, being strength-based approach that 2S LGBTQQIA relatives hold within communities. A wide variety of external factors ingrained in the design of systems and structures in the Canadian state continue to impact the lives of 2S LGBTQQIA people featured in the diagram as filling the white space around the fire, right? Not right. I feel as if I'm in conversation. The logs, as you can see them depicted there, the various mainstream identified gender-based analysis intersectional factors, while the flames red in the diagram of the fire describe the specific intersectionalities of 2S LGBTQQIA folks. I do want to say I was firekeeper centric in introducing this framework to my colleagues, in the sense that it was one shared thing amongst us all who are part of the subworking group. The commonality was that we all had teachings on fires. And so that's why we felt this was necessary to share with people visually on the specific needs and the impacts and the strengths of us as a community, despite gender-based violence and ongoing colonialism and heteropainting. Folks might be asking, well, what is heteropainting? It's a concept where, like I mentioned before in a couple slides ago, where 2S LGBTQQIA folks have been strategically erased out of conversations, events of indigeneity and the concepts shared with the greater public. And that can be seen in how October 4th is celebrated, MMIWG, our February 14th, a Strawberry Festival, which now also includes 2S LGBTQQIA folks. These actions, again, have erased and disappeared the experiences of 2S LGBTQQIA folks. Just gonna cough for a second. Thank you. And I think I just want to say how forward thinking this was, because fires don't have a gender. Fires don't have a sex. And fire is something that everybody needs and should have access to. So as a firekeeper, I take this literally in the sense that I can make a fire in any weather condition, but every person that I come in contact with is sacred. And as part of my responsibilities, it's I take it seriously that each person is sacred and has a fire within them, and that consensual solidarity stoke the flames and embers within each one of us. And that's a part of my responsibilities. And again, to go along with my firekeeping responsibilities, how this is forward thinking and a mechanism for folks to see a holistic experience of gender-based violence in terms of how we wanted to have folks support us in the helping sector, the education sector, the systems of oppression of carceral states, such as the criminal justice system, amongst your peer groups socially, about 2S LGBTQQIA folks and gender-based violence. So if anything, here's a way that is a for us by us. Here's a way that describes things that happen to us and that we're continually facing every day. And here are the ways in which we continue under the foot of colonialism, which is heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, whiteness, with its boot on our throat, continue to resurge despite ongoing experiences of gender-based violence. I'm gonna cough again. I'm gonna mute myself. So for folks, here's a very visual way for folks to have access as a way to build your critical reflexivity. Ask what are the origin stories, not like non-Indigenous people in the Canadian context go, where are you really from, right? But here's the origin story of the process and our response as a writer, as someone with lived experience, and as part of the Two-Spirit subworking group to the phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And the slides, you will have access to these. There's the link, the National Inquiry here, Reclaiming Power and Place, which was a rushed process of 2 years. My older sibling was able to attend in Toronto and share experiences with the loss of the youngest relative taken on the Highway of Tears, Monica Jack, was able to share the experiences of Diane Stewart, was able to share the experiences of CJ Fowler, was able to share the experiences of Roxanne Louis, and I shared the experience, not the whole entirety picture, of Alana Brown, the most recent relative who was taken from us. One thing that really helped inform me as the writer to give context and ways to genuinely provide, to hold space and to give space to the experiences of Two-Spirit and gender diverse folks is through the work of the Red Women Rising report, where they have many folks who I know, their names, and that they were able to say that as a Two-Spirit person, this is my experience of gender-based violence, which brought us together to have Sylvia Merkel chair the Two-Spirit subworking group and support all of us to bring all of our storying together to have this 100-page document, which you can find here, which talks about a very exhaustive list. We thought if we were going to compile something, we need to give people an origin story, and that prior to contact, 2S LGBTQQI folks were here, and that it is with colonialism, neocolonialism, that folks try to heteropaint us out of the past, and the experiences of indigeneity and Indigenous identity. And I just want to go back, I want to appropriately credit the Red Women Rising report is capturing the survivors in the downtown east side, and the authors are Carol Martin and Harsha Walia, folks who are non-Indigenous to Turtle Island or Indigeneity. You can be an accomplice or co-conspirator and support centering the experiences of those and gender-based violence, as Harsha Walia has. So I also want to note that the erasure of two-spirit and gender diverse folks is a legacy of colonialism, Christianity, and was enforced with the birth of the Indian Act. And later, when the first prime minister wanted to kill the Indian to save this child, with the birth of Indian residential schools. Want to note that women is only defined as cis women, and experiences of trans women are erased, as we have many images for October 4th and February 14th that have hashtag MMIW, which excludes the experiences of trans and gender diverse folks, which gave context to this report. One of the things that I also want to comment on in terms of the legacy of erasure of benevolence. Benevolence is a nice word to say, and I recognize the definition. Why wouldn't you want to be benevolent? To do good. And I think that is one of the failings and shortcomings of benevolence as taken up by the helping sectors, such as social work, because it also pits in opposition good Indian, bad Indian, who's good and who's deserving. And if anything, it lays the groundwork of the origin story of social work. It's not a secret that the origin story of social work created way for settlers to come to these land after the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And it didn't include Black and Indigenous and racialized folks, but yet those are the folks who continue to be overrepresented in that system currently. So I'm not saying you're a bad social worker. I think to develop, or a nurse practitioner or a lawyer or a court worker, I think to develop critical reflexivity, why me, why now, and who stands to benefit from the power that you hold over an individual, family, community, or nation. Kind of cough. So that's the critiques and how I want to engage benevolence as a concept. So I don't want to get into too much. Folks can read it. And I think I have questions from folks. It's important to recognize that another future is possible. And for folks who can touch on the links that have been forwarded to you, the recommendations for the Two-Spirit sub-working group are on pages 36 to 51, where we actively look at what you can do right now, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, and 15 years. In terms of right to culture, health and wellness, right to safety and security, and right to justice. So this is not just something that helping sectors can do, such as social work, but it can be anyone in attendance that can actualize these calls to action. And I also want to say again, this is at the generosity of the over 50 people that we were in conversation with, who were from the North as Inuit, and 2S LGBTQQIA, trans, gender diverse, and 2S LGBTQQIA and First Nations Métis Inuit, and or sex workers currently or formerly trafficked, who gave who contributed to the recommendations, so that this is a for us by us. We just did not pluck them out of the sky. This is from the very lived experiences on how folks can reduce the harms, that Indigenous folks with intersecting identities can move from surviving to thriving when it comes to gender-based violence. So which brings me to sorry, there was a cough stuck in my throat. So that's a framework for us to use and actualize. And non-Indigenous people, if you didn't know, you have the red paper in response to the white paper in 1969. You have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. You have the TRC calls to action and the National Inquiry. And now you have the Two-Spirit Subworking Group. There is a lot of data and information that talks about specifically the experiences of Indigenous people and in the context of gender-based violence and what you could do to minimize these experiences structurally, systemically, on a macro level and on an individual level. So folks want to know, what can I do? This is not an exhaustive list. But here are some things that you can do. It's very direct. And I think now is the time for people to take direction. The first thing you can do is stop engaging in trauma porn, learning off our traumas and back. We are more than the trauma that happens to us. We are beautiful community members, land-based, urban-based, finding our way from out underneath ongoing colonialism. Report after report has been written. So one thing I pose for you folks, what more does the nation state of Canada need? What more do you need as a decision maker, as you are being groomed to go into decision-making positions in the government, various levels of government, and then when education happens at the adult level and post-secondary, high school to children, in the health sector with nurse practitioners, dental hygienists, doctors, and in the helping sector when it comes to houselessness for 2SLGBTQQIA folks, or detox centers, or shelters, or crisis lines. What further does it take for you to implement these? The blueprint has been written. It's your time to activate them personally, professionally, and in your communities. And much like Justice Murray Sinclair gifted us, the TRC calls to action was overwhelming. What he wanted to do was, he said, take one action and make it your life's work. So take one recommendation from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People and make that your life's work. Take one of the TRC calls to action, make that your life's work. Take one of the calls to justice, either in the National Inquiry or the Two-Spirit Subworking Group, and make that your life's work, personally, professionally, and in your communities. Because it's very important. Again, Black folks have gifted us with eating the other, desire and resistance. Bell Hooks, gay gifted us eating the other in terms of trauma porn, commodification of the other in terms of different races, ethnicities than white, to be eaten by white society, or cisgender, or heterosexual, or able-bodied, and either wanting fulfillment or pleasure after eating it. Consequences of eating the other leads to the denial of history as well as politics. Hooks, 1992, also explains that eating the other isn't beneficial to whom it is being eaten. Concurrently, marginalized group, in this case, 2S LGBTQQIA folks who experience gender-based violence, deemed other, who have been ignored, rendered invisible, can be seduced by emphasis on otherness, by its commodification, because it offers the promise of recognition and reconciliation. Another settler logic of dispossession and disappearance. Getting stuck in action, for example. Now, this is not to anyone in particular, but a critique for folks to be critically reflexive on. For example, wearing an orange shirt, but not teach about Indian residential schools and the legacy. How many times are people meant to tell their stories before action happens? How much pain must be put on display for Indigenous people's humanity to be acknowledged? For my 6 relatives and the thousands of other individuals who suffered a loss and later found out that their relative was murdered? What will it take for folks to move from inaction to action? Something that you can look to. Audley Huntley has done something in collaboration with METROC, which is a provincial gender-based violence agency. Don't Need Saving, Aboriginal Women and Access to Justice. And Bell Hooks, Looks, Race and Representation, Eating the Other. So those are some of the things that you can do. Some of the things, hopefully, that discomfort you and unsettle you. I didn't go into too deep the experiences. You can read them based on the links that were shared. I'm going to mute and and for scholars in attendance, here's a link to the Two-Spirit National Action Plan. If this is something you want to share with your colleagues and have a critical conversation, here's at a glance. For those wanting to use this as a reflection for classes, conversations, here's the in-text citation, and here's for your reference pages. I'm gonna mute myself and look at the questions, and maybe someone can unmute, like cough and post some questions, and we can be in dialogue.
Percy, Lillian and I would love to present some of the questions that have come in for you while you're presenting, and we'll move right into that. And Lillian, I wondered if you wanted to start us off.
Okay, thanks, Linda. First of all, miigwech to Dr. Lezard, especially for speaking to us during your illness at this time. And one of the questions was, can you explain again the difference between the 2 sides of the fire, you know, in your diagram between the gender-based violence and the 2SLGBTQQIA and intersectionality factors? Want to just touch on that a bit, please?
I was touching a bunch of things, but it didn't unmute. So we were very, very intentional. The gray rocks were the experiences of 2S LGBTQQIA folks. I wish I had a book. The external factors were above, the upper part above the flames, and in yellow were the intersectional factors. The logs down below were the cultural strengths. Now I'm just looking at something really small. So those are the ways in which we wanted to provide a holistic account of gender-based violence and an analysis that was lacking in other reports and other stakeholders in the National Inquiry. If you are able to go to that page, you'll see the various provinces and territories were able to submit. First Nations, Métis, Inuit folks were able to submit their final reports, and you can see the very specific experiences based on those identities. But what we brought was a 2S-LGBTQQIA, and not just a trauma porn approach, but just providing a holistic picture and experience for folks to not just see, oh, we're just XYZ and insert stereotype or trope about the 2S-LGBTQQIA folks, but really wanted to position the responsibility structurally and systemically as to contributing to ongoing colonialism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, transphobia, homophobia, and be very specific about those things. And it's lifelong learning. So yeah, so I think a lot can be learned from many of the disciplines here to incorporate these approaches, and because I know many folks here might be from the medical field, might be working in the social services sector or the education sector, and this is a holistic approach into looking at Indigenous people, in particular 2S-LGBTQQIA folks, and their experiences of gender-based violence.
Miigwech.
Dr. Lezard, can you speak more about the impact and importance of storying for 2S-LGBTQQIA plus individuals?
Well, the context that we're here, I believe that we're taking a disability social justice framework approach, in the sense that we're providing visuals for folks who learn visually, written text for folks who learn intellectually. Like we're disrupting the types of knowledge transference happens. You're having someone with lived experience as a family member, someone who's experienced gender-based violence, and as Thomas King has gifted us in the world with, the truth about stories is that is all we are, in the sense that in terms of orality. As someone who has been in the academic industrial complex for 15 to 18 years now, it is one of the methodology approaches that I take in the ways in which students can submit assignments, conversations, to disrupt what the institution wants, written form. That's not the only text. It's important because it centers us in the conversation and our experiences. And we get to share as much or as little as we want, based on how you as individuals are part of the learning network or a part of the academic industrial complex have engaged the 2S-LGBTQQIA folks will determine my level of disclosure or the disclosures of communities with you. I think one thing, if folks walk away, or as folks leave, folks are no longer part of this conversation or this presentation, trying to use non-ableist language, that it requires trust, and it should be mutually beneficial stories, and that it's a gift when an Indigenous person in front of you, in your class, in your office, at an appointment, shares a story with you, because we've had over 530 years of other people telling our stories for us, and they got it wrong. And they only inserted their own the ways in which cultural imperialism impacted the way the stories were told about us. So a consistency of behavior over an extended period of time is what you can do to build trust in order for individuals, families, communities, and nations can engage in story or storytelling. It's a way for us as individuals. Now, this is just for Indigenous folks. I recognize other people have stories, but the context here is Indigenous folks, First Nations, Métis, Afro-Indigenous, and Black Indigenous, because that includes my definition of Indigeneity in this context. Where was I going? I got COVID brain. Yeah, and that we have our own stories that we tell each other, and that we don't actually share in front of folks who do not have membership, or who have not been invited in, or who have not engaged in relations or relationality with us as communities.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. I have another question, Dr. Percy Lezard. How do you feel would be a beneficial way to support 25 people in our community? And this is a question from one of the participants. Although we as a community as a whole, especially in our region, are overly marginalized group that gets referred to as gay natives, but it goes deeper than that, and creating safe space and going that distance. How would you approach this?
There are so many barriers. One of the things that I have made a part of my practice, now I have the benefit of splitting my time. Crap, I was a terrible relative. I did not situate myself geographically. I am upholding the dish with one spoon of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, as an invited guest here in Toronto. And I split my time between my homelands, which is in Pinkton, which I shared is either a village between lakes or a place to live forever. Now, when I'm in Toronto, I get the benefit of access to many individuals who are 2S and trans affirming in their care. And that came at the labor of many people who came before me. I would be remiss if I said that I got to come to this space and place and be in conversation with you folks if it wasn't for the likes of Christos, Beth Brandt, and all the Indigenous folks who came before me, and their blood, sweat, and tears, and often their death. So I think folks in attendance, what I share is not a one-size-fits-all. I recognize out of the 90s, one of the things that came from the 90s was if you went to this 2-hour conversation, you got to check a box and you could then be equipped on how to support 2S LGBTQQI folks in terms of gender-based violence. You can't. I'm the writer of this document. I have education. I've been a social worker for 35 plus years, and it still does not make sense because the ways in which colonialism continues to impact me and the communities I have membership in. So I think one of the things, just going back to what I do, there are people who are often turned to as Indigenous, as Two-Spirit, as trans, who are asked to speak on a lot of things. And one thing that I would like to pose, and I have posed across my socials, is what is our investment in succession planning and scaffolding, right? How are we providing access to information, funds, resources for those coming behind us? And why me? Why now? And who continues to benefit from me being in this position? Because as I support Black, racialized, Indigenous, 2S, LGBTQQIA disabled folks in a wide variety of areas, I show them a map, and I say, these are some of the things on there, and these are some of the barriers and sites of celebration. Here is a working glossary and that I have used. What would you like to be on this map? Where would you like to go? And how would you like to get there? And I will use everything that I can with what little power I have to help you get there. The only thing I ask is that you bring 3 people with you, and that you then turn around and help 3 others, whether it's in education, the nonprofit sector, activism. So I ask for people who are in leadership positions in cities, in provinces, colonial provinces or territories, who have you already started to support to replace you? Who are you raising up? And how are you celebrating them to be equipped to deal with the ongoing legacy of colonial, non-Indigenous governance systems in your nonprofits, in your classrooms, in the criminal justice system, in medical offices. I think if we had a movement like that nationally, we would have a wide variety of voices to hear from, the actual diversity of voices and experiences. Because I think choice is not just, can Percy speak on this as the writer, but can Percy and the hundreds of others that Percy has been co-creating the conditions forward speak to this? And why is Percy, with a PhD, the one who's being sought after? Because knowledge is, indigenous knowledge is that there's multiple ways of knowing and being. And so I want to raise up the voices of the folks in community who continue to push back. And I recognize this is the learning network, and it's situated within the academic industrial complex. But again, here's another way we can reimagine another future is possible. And that 2S LGBTQQIA folks, young folks, have been showing us the way for some time as land and water defenders. And it's not just land and water defenders who are coming into contact with the law, but they're actually protecting the water and the land for all of us. And the ways in which violence happens on the land because of resource extraction, because they've been able to identify and note that resource is not just what's on the periodical table of elements, but in terms of women, girls, and 2S LGBTQQIA folks. So yeah, it was a very roundabout way to respond to that, because again, folks, I might not have the answer, but that is one of the thousands of ways a response can happen to that. And I don't like to say sorry, because sorry is such an overabused term in the sense that it actually doesn't talk about behavior change. I hope the person who asked that question, you're able to get the support from folks and not experience the investment of whiteness in the ways in which queer agencies are tasked with lifting up and supporting, can support in a culturally informed, culturally safe and trauma-informed way the experiences of 2S LGBTQQIA folks in rural settings, reserve settings, or non-urban settings. And I know it might not have been an answer, but it's a response.
We good.
So many questions, but I'm going to go here next for you, Dr. Lezard, to answer. Lezard, I'm so sorry, Percy. How can sex educators be more inclusive or more representational in terms of the education they're providing in terms of Indigiqueer experiences?
I'm going to point you to folks like Native Youth Sexual Health Network. They're a national body that does not recognize the Canadian American border. It's a for us, by us. It's truly representative of age, geography, information, and it's decolonial in its approach. One thing about Indigenous people, we're not allowed to have a sexuality or be sexual without being othered. And sex ed is white. And it's in English or French, which is, I recognize, the national language of the Canadian nation state. How are you providing access to language speakers to support folks visually with anatomy in Indigenous languages? Are first steps, and I think that should take you the rest of your career to do that. Person who asked that question, you can learn. So that means you have to build a relationship with Native Youth Sexual Health Network, and all their resources online. They're quite exhaustive, and they are actualizing ways to support the stigma around talking about sex, because if anything has been continued to remind us COVID showed us who the haves and have-nots are. And Indigenous people were the have-nots and continue to be the have-nots because we're not seen with humanity or worthy, or benevolence sneaks in that we're not good enough, the good, right? So those are some starting points. And I think those 3 or 4 things shall take you to the rest of your career. Person who asked that question. Yeah.
One of the questions, just to build on that, because you went there yourself and then back to you, Lillian, but one of the questions was, how do we choose that one action recommendation from the Truth and Reconciliation and make it the rest of our lives' work without overstepping or without in some way contributing to the silencing of Indigenous voices?
I don't have the answer for that. Some people, what works for people, open a book, put your finger there, put it there. Is that something you can do? What area of your life? Like, it can't just be something you do professionally at your paid work. Indigenous people don't stop being Indigenous just because you went off shift, whether it's because you're a doctor, a nurse, a school teacher, a university professor, a lawyer, a law clinic, working in a law clinic. So our indigeneity doesn't clock off at 5 at the end of the day. Neither should your commitment to consensual solidarity. Notice the words I chose: consensual solidarity, meaning what relationships do you have with Indigenous people? Because you're telling on yourself more than asking me for direction if you don't actively have relationships with Indigenous people or communities. What are the ways in which your program, department, classroom is accessible or accessed by Indigenous people, right? And what is their role once they're in that space? So those are a lot of the questions that you can ask yourself, and make it. You have to make the adjustment, and only you as individuals can answer that. I can't, because you could tell me one thing, but your life is different. Like, you say this, but if I look at your socials, who are your friends on social media, right? What kind of conversations are you having on days, national days, or days when somebody had a mental health check done on them and it went terrible, right? What conversations are you pushing back on when it comes to where you're standing at the water cooler? Right? So if you want to start with your personal life, start with your personal life, because that's who you surround yourself with, and that's who contributes to your values and your beliefs. Have these conversations. For folks in attendance, there were over 900, there are 2,000. So there should be 6,000 people reading this if they have not read the Two-Spirit final report. So people, read it through, have conversations with other people in your life, ask 3 other people to read it, and then be in conversation with them. And then you collectively decide, let's work on this, for this, let's include this, because everybody here to some degree has a strategic plan. Let's pick one as education or medical, one call to justice, and make it part of our strategic plan. And that way you continually get assessed based on your meetings, supervision, your board, your employees, whatever setting, board of governance, the Senate, right, can assess, where are we? How are we doing? How have we dropped the ball? And how can we make the adjustments? Because lives definitely depend on whether or not 2,000 people read this document, 2,000 people leave this conversation and presentation and do something about it in their personal, professional, and political lives. It's a fact. So that's why I continue to pose, why is there inaction? And what will it take for you non-Indigenous folks to move from inaction to action?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lillian?
Okay. You were talking about, can you explain more along the term of trauma porn? Can you give an examples of the contents that meets this criteria? Although, you know, I understand that, you know, in talking about Indigenous issues, it's important that we talk about, you know, what's going on but it's moving past that. And how would you?
Again, at the generosity and continued loss of Black mothers to gun violence of police and the carceral state, that we only saw their lost children, adult children, as human because they were shot. Trauma porn. They were more than just the violence that happened to them. And that's something that the generosity of the Black mothers, Black families, Black queer folks, Black trans folks have gifted Indigenous folks here on the north of the border, in the sense that Indigenous people are more than just the crappy things that happen to us, without actually looking at the systemic and structural reasons that contribute to ongoing harm and violence against us. Let's situate the perpetrators of this, its policies that contribute to values and attitudes and biases. It's no longer unconscious bias when you consciously say, Percy, you're aggressive. Percy, you only talk about this. Right? It becomes conscious because you're focusing on one aspect of my identity and what I talk about, and the identities of the Indigenous people in front of you. Oh, this is all Indigenous people do. And I do not want to insert for the Indigenous and Black and racialized folks in attendance. I don't want to talk about the tropes. There are lots of tropes, and I'm sure we could come up with 100, but I don't want to traumatize my relatives in attendance who are Indigenous, racialized, and Black by talking about what those are. I think there needs to be a shift with people in attendance, that humanity is humanity despite trauma and violence, especially Indigenous people with intersecting identities. You need to make that shift. I don't. I see myself as a sacred being, and any Indigenous, racialized Black person with intersecting identities I come into contact is a sacred being. And those are my values and my beliefs. So something about the values and beliefs of non-Indigenous people, needs to shift, seeing Indigenous people with intersecting identities with humanity, to only see us through the lens of the harm that happens to us. That at that time is when you will take it upon yourself to move from inaction to action. I know psychologists in the groups can go social loafing somebody else. Well, report this or stand up. Stand-ups are not just marches and protests. Stand-ups are at the water cooler in your spaces, interrupting and interjecting and saying, I want to push back on that, Lillian. When you talk about this, I just want to let you know that impacts people. Those can be some small things that people can actively do. Because again, like I mentioned earlier, it's unethical for me to say that I'm a safe person. I'm not, because tomorrow's International Pronouns Day. We had International Coming Out Day. It is not safe for people to be actually who they are, because we are in a cisnormative, heteropatriarchal society that benefits those identities. And when we don't need those days anymore, we all get to be who we are as sacred gifts, right? Yeah.
I think this next question, Dr. Lezard, kind of builds on where you ended with that one, but goes a little more personal. One of our participants says, I'm a Mi'kmaq and identify as Indigiqueer. The transphobia and homophobia is so prevalent in my own family due to a history of trauma that has resulted from 2SLGBTQQIA+ being forced to live life in secret. How can we better decolonize and re-indigenize our communities so our kin are safer and upheld again in our traditional roles? Are there distractions to keep in mind for our relations living in urban versus reserve settings? Sorry, not distractions, distinctions. I'm sorry.
There is no one response to that. There honestly needs to be thousands of responses. Even though colonialism came with one approach, there needs to be hundreds to come out from under the ways in which 2S LGBT Indigiqueer folks experience ongoing discrimination, whether it's internalized, whether it's from your family, bio, chosen, extended, whether it's your community, whether it's your nation, or in your relations to non-MIGMA people. I know I can relate because I experience ongoing homophobia and C-sexism. I get dead named and misgendered. There's no one answer. I know when I worked at Two-Spirited People of the First Nations for 14 years as the educator here in Toronto, the longest serving person there, I should say, when I left from my appointment at University of Manitoba and then now here at Wilfrid Laurier, that I had to spend a lot of my time when in conversation. Now, this is just specifically only for Indigenous people. It's a response. It's not the only answer. Folks get to be voyeuristic if you're non-Indigenous in this response. I had to spend a lot of my time in education seminars, workshops, and trainings when in conversation with Indigenous people about how colonialism continues to affect our people in the sense that what happened to my sibling, who was the last person in our family to go to residential school, our parents, their siblings, my grandparents and their siblings, was an act of power and control by same-sex fathers and nuns. And who I am is a gift and sacred, right? So having to really peel back and really share with our relatives that Indigenous relatives, and these were knowledge keepers who were supporting people in the many Indigenous agencies as elders and knowledge keepers and facilitating ceremony, that I was supporting through their own healing and learning process to differentiate and to peel back that who your child or your grandchild or your niblet is not the same thing as to what happened to you in residential school or day school. They are a gift, and reminding them of that. I continue to do that with my own family, my community, and my nation, and as an invited guest here in the Dish with One Spoon, of helping our relatives remember, because I was in a recent conversation with Dr. Lynn Lavalle and Andig at Ryerson X Toronto Met, whatever their name is now, on this concept, a concept that I came up with based on my lived experiences. You can research it. Someone, Misogyny, which again, Moya Bailey, Black thinkers, Black femmes, gifted this process of being targeted because their sex, gender, their race, and their sex. I took it a bit further, and I wanted to talk about the experiences of being targeted by Indigenous cis het people for my intersecting identities, specifically around my Indigenous identity. I'm not Indian enough because I don't wear a skirt, because I don't have biological children, or that my partner is not a man, a cis man. Misogyny, it's online. It's a talk that talks about the specific ways. So I think that's the era we are in. And some of the examples of that are recently with National Chief Joanne Archibald had to experience with the Assembly First Nation, where predominantly cisgendered Indigenous male chiefs tried to out of order remove her as the national chief because she was asking for transparency and the ways in which an arm of the Canadian government, and let's be very clear, the Assembly First Nation is an extension of the Canadian government. So yeah, so misogyny wheel. So what does it take? On reserve, one thing, it was constructed to do what it was meant to do. It was meant to remove Indigenous people from the landscape that we actually existed and are here. I think that's also what contributed to our taking our humanity, dehumanizing us. It moved us away. And so what we learn, and at this time we have 126 years of the Indian residential schools of how not to be an Indian, and the Indian Act of how not to be an Indian, and then you throw in there being tested upon, sterilization, and then the social workers coming in and being the foot soldiers to remove the children and move them into residential schools. We got taught what not to do and fear about who we are. So there's a lot of work that we as a people need to do, and gentle conversations, reminding folks prior to contact. And one of the ways is which in Mi'kmaq, what is the word for you as an Indigiqueer? I pushed my language speakers to find the word for me in my language. Stamia in Indigenous is two-spirit. I know it's hard. Sorry, interpreters. Menimchilks, MNIMCELX, is non-binary. And then my language speakers actually told me and came to their aha moment of our language actually is non-binary in the sense that it doesn't have a sex or a gender. It's in when we translate it that it becomes binary. And I'm like, so we are non-binary speakers, right? So I find that in coming into contact with other Indigenous people and posing the same questions to them, everything's connected to our language, right? You can't separate language from culture and people. They're all interconnected. So who are you? Ask your language speakers for the name in Mi'kmaq for who you are. Because someone has it. It's in our blood. Somebody has it somewhere. And that's a starting point. Everybody was hurt, and that's no excuse. But everybody deserves to have space held for them. My siblings now are, lack of a better word right now, because I'm starting to fade, are trained, lack of a better word, folks, that's not what I mean, to now interject when somebody dead names me or misgenders me. So find like-minded people who are committed to being a good relative and being inclusive, right? So those are some things that I would, yeah. And I was just going back to non-binary. One of the things that I've pushed knowledge keepers and people who facilitate ceremony, without 2S LGBTQQIA folks, you don't have a circle. We are the circle. The future is 2S LGBTQQIA specific. Because many Indigenous languages, in terms of futurities, are not gendered or have a sex. So to truly center and step away from heteropatriarchy, our investment in whiteness, right, is to actually honor and celebrate 2S LGBTQQIA folks. Because prior to contact, you'll find in the stories from their storytellers that women, the matriarchs, children, those with disabilities, 2S LGBTQQIA folks, and young folks were the sacred beings of the nation. So it's a reminder to center that and how we move forward. And of course, it's nation specific. Folks in attendance who are non-Indigenous, don't think that The people that you come into contact will have the same access to language and concepts as I have, or the ways forward. This is based on thousands of hours of being in ceremony and conversation with people, of me often falling on my face, being embarrassed, reminded how I've been ableist, or I've internalized my own colonialism in terms of gender identity, expression, sexuality, indigeneity. Know that it's messy as you continue to grow and as you continue to build relationships with Indigenous individuals, families, communities, and nations. But take that mess to someone else, to someone non-Indigenous, to hold space for you and your messiness. Don't put that labor on me. Because I always say that when you misgender me, don't say sorry, just say thank you. When it's been brought to your attention that that's not the pronoun I use or someone you come into contact uses, say thank you for that, because they took that opportunity to say, I want to actually build a relationship with you. And I want to remind you, you're not seeing all of me. And this is all of me because my pronouns are they, them, theirs. Otherwise, I would just walk and not give you a moment's notice or care about this relationship I have with you. So say thank you, make the adjustments and move on. And that can be said of what call to action you decide to act upon. It might not work for the people around you because this geographically might not work because it might not be resources to make it sustainable, and that's okay. It's a guiding point, something you can work towards in your position, in your program, in your department, in your agency, in your profession, right? Yeah.
I am looking at the time and how long that we have kept you talking. And I want to just let you start, Lillian, by expressing your gratitude to Percy Lezard.
Okay. Miigwech, for taking the time to do your presentation today. I personally learned a lot from what you were talking about, and I mean, it was very informative and gave myself a lot to think about in regards to realizing the full impacts of all when you look at one Indigenous issue and then how how it impacts, like how we need to take the full picture into consideration. Miigwech for your time.
I learned a lot too, Dr. Lezard, and I also feel that I got a gentle but firm kick in the butt, perhaps, if I can put it that way. And I really believe what you said. I think we'll do a lot of thinking as we leave this time together. And we did have close to 1,000 people were with us. That is amazing and speaks to people's willingness and their desire to learn and to spend time. And we thank you for that, for making that time. And we do hope you get better soon and that you have a chance to rest now. I know at one point you were heading to a class after this, so I hope perhaps that isn't the case and that you have a chance to get some rest.
You mean a compromise? So one of the worst things to happen to me is happening. It's been over 2 years and 7 months that I've been very vigilant about wearing a mask, sanitizing, and keeping my distance. It's while I was on reserve, playing bingo with my mother, that I got COVID. One time that I didn't put a mask on right away. It's still here. Please be a good neighbor, be a good relative. Stay 6 feet, wear a mask. It's not gone away just because the provincial health organizations and our political people no longer make the reports does not mean it's not happening. I just want to raise my hands up and I put it in the chat for Black, Indigenous, and racialized 2SLGBTQQIA folks in attendance. You have shared identities. I raise my hands up to you, and I appreciate your patience and generosity in witnessing this conversation. I know I got a lot wrong, and I know I have a lot to learn and still a lot to do. And hopefully I did not do a disservice to us and our lived experiences and our accomplices and co-conspirators. There's a lot of work to do. As the dish with the 2-woe wampum belt teaching share with us, the two canoes and the 2 rivers. Time to get in your canoe and start paddling. A lot of work to be done. I look forward to seeing the harms against 2S LGBTQQIA folks minimized from 10,000 to 200. We all have a role in this. We all have a responsibility. And again, lives depend on it. And I turn to you folks. Lim Lam, meaning thank you for your time and attention on this very serious topic.
Thank you. And with that, we will close the webinar. And again, the browser will open up into the evaluation, and don't forget the list of resources that Dr. Lezard kindly provided with links that the team will make sure that you have probably sent you this morning. And we hope you'll join us for a future webinar. Bye for now.
Okay.